that's the worst thing ever. Sport is really poison. Like, it breaks down our bodies no matter what you do, right? But strength training, that's the antidote. That's the thing that keeps kids healthy. That's the thing that develops some kind of structural balance.
Hey there, welcome to our podcast. Before we jump into today's episode, could you please do us a solid? If you're enjoying what you hear, give us a 5-star rating and hit that subscribe button on your platform. It really helps us reach more parents, coaches, and youth in the youth athlete development scene. All right, let's get into this week's chat.
Welcome back to In Athlete Podcast. This episode is a very special episode of mine. I get to interview my former mentor, well, still continues to be my mentor, Kevin Schultz. He is the Olympic Strength and Conditioning Director at the University of Wisconsin. He is also a very close friend of mine that I actually mentored under in 2017. And it was one of the most phenomenal experiences I had working with the Olympic sports program at Wisconsin in the strength and conditioning capacity. This one does not by any means let down the anticipation of this, because there's been a long time between drinks and when we last spoke to each other. And I think this is a really special one for me personally, and I'm very happy to be able to share this with everyone out there. So listen in, and this is going to be a doozy. See you on the next one.
Welcome back to the In Athlete Podcast. I've got a very special episode here today. A former mentor, but also a former housemate as well. Basically, his background is, he's the director of Olympic Strength and Conditioning since 2021. He was the associate director of Olympic Strength Conditioning in 2015 to 2021. Is basically the oversight of 22 sports programs, which is quite a lot of sporting programs. You got 5 full-time coaches, 2 graduate assistants, and then you're currently working with volleyball. Is that the primary sport that you're working with at the moment?
It's, thank goodness, the only sport I work with in the moment. And it's one of those things where when I took over running our department, I kind of gave myself a singular team to manage the rest of the department, but also it kind of gives me the ability to kind of be a little bit more transient and stop in and see other teams, watch my coaches coach, and just be a little bit better as an administrator, just giving me the bandwidth and flexibility to do that. So, if we have a staff member who's sick, I jump in their session. If we have a staff member who's lucky enough to maybe have a child coming, I'll jump in those sessions. So it's just one of those things where you're just being present and flexible and available for your staff. It makes them feel secure. And so instead of my staff members having to cover each other, I'm always there as like a resource to like, hey, all right, so Jim's out, so Kevin's in. And it gives me touch points with the athlete trainers, the sport coaches, the student athletes that I don't necessarily get to oversee on the daily. So it's been a really good change.
Yeah, and just tell us a little bit about your background as well. How did you get into coaching? How did you get to this point?
Man, that is a deep-seated and long path to get there, but I'll do my best. And it's one of those things where, I've been going, I'm 41, so I'm kind of like going through this like existential midlife crisis, right? It's just a very American thing for us to do. And I'm trying to figure out like why coaching means so much to me. And really, it's one of those things where like athletics started at a really young age. And I say really young now that I'm 41, but at 13, and really, from the age I was 13 to 23, I was a youth athlete to a college athlete. And then like at 23, at some point, most athletes have to give up being athletes, and they go through this midlife crisis, right? Like a loss of identity. And for me, I never really lost the identity. I just went from athlete to coach. And from 23 on, that's all I've been doing is coaching. And so coaching and athletics is really all I've ever known. And from formative years, from being a youth and what sport means to us in the States. And I think for a lot of people, sport is religion. It's community. It's, working towards a singular goal, and, there's sacrifice and commitment, all those things. And for me, that really filled that gap in my formative years. And then as I went through college, I always knew that I wanted to be a coach, right? Like I find myself in this spot because I had so many great, coaches who became mentors, who became friends, just kind of like our relationship there's this kind of like paradigm of how things shift and transition within athletics that I haven't really heard or seen in many other sectors. And so I always knew that I wanted to be involved somewhere within athletics. And so right out of, high school or my prep, period, I went right to college and I wanted to be a physical education major. I'm like, well, all I really know is sports. I'm not very good at them, but I know So I'm going to go be a physical education teacher. And, when I was there at my undergrad, I played college football and made some great friends and found some great mentors and coaches and leaders. And, it's just one thing leads to another. And, I think the one thing that's really unique about me in the position I hold is like the director of Olympic strength and conditioning is I actually spent a lot of the formative years as a strength coach, as a sport coach. And so, I've coached high school athletics, high school American football. I've coached college football, college athletics. And so like very few of my peers that hold my position have actually been in the seats of our sport coaches and understand like, the demands that they go into. I think there's always a little bit of like, oh, what are they doing? They don't really do much. They just go to practice. But like when you actually take a step back and you recognize, oh yeah, so when we're at home in bed sleeping, they're on the phone calling recruits because let's be honest, like most high school kids, the only time you can get in contact with them is from 8 p.m. to midnight because they're in school, they're in practice. And so like as a sport coach, your day never ends. But as a strength coach, like at some point you can kind of like unplug and turn the phone off. And so it just in my role, just having the ability to really understand what our sport coaches are going through, having a little bit of empathy has been something that I think has been really beneficial to my role and being able to connect with our sport coaches because really at the end of the day, they're at the top of our ecosystem, outside of like our high administrators, like our sport coaches are kind of the ones who reign over everything in our college system. So, sport coach, strength coach, kind of done it all, but just found myself at UW Madison now for the last 9 years.
That basically answers one of my questions. So, but we'll come back to it anyways. But I want just to give a bit people of a snapshot. So I've done a few presentations to university students recently, and they didn't really understand Division I college sports. Can you give them a bit more of an understanding because there's been some massive movements in the last couple of years? Just give me a quick rundown of UW athletics and also just college sports in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely in the States, it's absolutely bonkers, the amount of resources and funding and what college sports mean to our communities and, our states, right? And so like in the state of Wisconsin, which is just a small little state in the country of, United States, like there's one flagship university and that's the University of Wisconsin. And it's one of those universities that, it's our one research institution. So there's a lot of brilliant people in the city of Madison. It's the state capital. And so we have all these things going for us. But frankly, the athletic department is probably the most notable and recognizable entity in the state. It's maybe the Green Bay Packers and maybe it's the Milwaukee Brewers and Milwaukee Bucks, but everybody in Wisconsin, no matter who you are, like the Wisconsin Motion W means something to people. It's a big enterprise. Like last year, our operational budget was, north of $190 million. The facilities are just absolutely bonkers. We're in the business right now building a new American football facility, like practice facility, offices. That's like $285 million US. And so it's just, there's massive amounts of money getting poured into it because ultimately, when you look at it, the amount of money and revenue that athletics within, the University of Wisconsin bring to the state of Wisconsin is bananas. I've seen numbers in the past and some research I've done that, each home football game, American football game that we host here at UW brings in net of $16 million, and that's into the community, right? So it's parking and, people attending and going to bars and tailgating, all that stuff. And so it's a huge economic impact. More specifically, the athletic department itself, we have about 800 student athletes, about 400 staff members. We have so many facilities and gizmos and gadgets and toys and technologies that you can shake a stick at. But we're just really lucky because ultimately, at UW, it comes down to the people. We're not as highly funded as some universities. We don't have as much, money as what they may have down in Texas from all the oil money. But it's one of those things where, we have such good people that are all really working hard. Out of that 800 student athletes, you have 23 sports. Each of those 23 sports is going to have, a slightly different head coach, and each of those head coaches are going to have, 2 to 3 assistants, and then there's going to be support staff, strength coaches, sports medicine professionals, sports psychologists, dietitians, and then there's the whole other side of our operation, which is really like the student centered side. So academics, career leadership, diversity and inclusion, community outreach, and like our alumni group. And so it's a massive operation with, just a ton of resources, people here. I coming from a smaller Division III school with less sports, less athletes, less resources, to the University of Wisconsin, where you have all those things. People are always like, well, what's the big difference between, this small school and this big school? And really, it's everybody at Wisconsin has the job they want. Where in previous stops at smaller institutions, like I was a strength coach and a football coach, or I was a strength coach and track and field coach. Here, I just get to be the strength coach. And so when you start like layering in years of experience with just one task, like you could see why people get really good at their craft in positions like this, and why our student athletes are able to flourish despite, maybe having facility constraints or, technology or funding constraints. But realistically, it's a massive enterprise that just keeps churning and burning and growing within the United States.
And talk to us about like the international side as well. So you got a lot of international student athletes. Where are they coming from? How do they even enter the system as well to become a Badger?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I would say, it's in my experience, we've had a lot of international students come through our doors with a lot of our different sports. And I haven't seen one direct path that's been the most successful. I think a lot of it just comes from what country you're coming from, what sport you play, and what connections you may have. So I can speak specifically to volleyball, and I'm very happy to say that we have a high number of international students. It's funny, like we have 3 Canadians, 2 Polish international student athletes, and then 1 athlete from Turkey, right? So almost 50% of our roster going into next year will be international student athletes. And, some of it is, student athletes seeking us out and finding us online. There's, obviously some of our sports have huge international followings, and it's just what the motion W means. But really what has come down to quite a bit, I've come to recognize with our international students, is like this legacy or connection effect, where, one student athlete somehow finds their way into the door at a university, and that opens up the conversation from where that, student athlete came from. And it just perpetuates, So for example, this is a really interesting story. So we have one of our seniors on our volleyball team going into this year. Back in 2019, we were traveling abroad. Every 4 years, the volleyball team will do an international trip, right? It's one of those things where it gives us the opportunity to coach and, watch our kids play, gives us the opportunity to go overseas and create lifelong lessons and memories. But it's also kind of a recruiting trip. And so in 2019, we're up in Slovenia playing the Polish junior national team, and it's like they're like U20 team. But they got this gal that's playing up for them. She's only 16, and she's just lighting us up, right? And so it's like, oh, all right, I wonder, would she be interested in coming to the States and playing? Oh, yeah, she does have interest in playing volleyball. And so ends up, she comes to Wisconsin, and she starts her freshman year as a left side outside hitter for us, was the conference freshman of the year, and has had a great career. And then, 2 years ago, another one of her Polish junior national team mates was like, hey, I'm kind of interested in playing in the States. And so it's just kind of like that connection. And you see it all over with a lot of our sports, where there's like these hotbeds of different sports from different countries within these specific universities. One of the things that at the University of Wisconsin, we actually have a lot of people from down under, whether it's Australia or New Zealand, on our men's cross country team. And our men's cross country team is a top 10 finisher year over year over year. And it's really one of those things where there's a direct pipeline. And it's interesting. These are head men's cross country coaches, not from Australia. He's from over in Europe. But for whatever reason, he got one really good Aussie runner in, and then another one decided to show up. And all of a sudden, we got like 4 or 5 Aussies on our men's cross country / athletics team. And we're just winning championships. I mean, they won the Big Ten indoor tournament this past winter, and then, like I said, I think they finished top 10 in nationals at the cross country meet this fall. And so, and a lot of it is those international athletes. And so, what I've seen is there's just a pipeline. It's people, student athletes or students, from abroad, just reaching out, finding schools. And it's one of those things where I think there's going to be at least within our Olympic sports, so everything outside of American football, I do think there's going to be a higher increase in the international student athletes. And it's kind of right now, there's this major shift going on in college athletics with this thing called name, image, and likeness. And so student athletes can now get paid for signing autographs or guest appearances. And it's banana lands. Like, we just lost 2 men's basketball players because they're going to go make $750,000 for a 1-year stint at some other school. And so that's when you talk about culture, when you talk about team, and you talk about development within what the college system used to be, that really doesn't exist now anymore, at least for some of our higher marketability sports. But the thing is international student athletes, unfortunately, right now aren't able to capitalize on NIL because of state regulations, right? And so all of our international players on the volleyball team aren't able to sign autographs, or not able to go to endorsements, right? But that also means they're not going to be tempted to leave because there's more money at a different school. And so I would not be surprised that, going forward, if you see a higher number of international athletes on some of our, Olympic-based sports, because it's going to create stability within the roster. And it's going to give the ability to develop our student athletes like we always have, without fear of them leaving. And student athletes can kind of come and go now with these new transfer rules. They used to be more prohibitive, but now you can kind of put your name in a website, and the next day you're going to a different university, just like any other student would have the right to do on campus. But it's just, things are kind of starting to turn a little bit more money driven. And so you see a lot more turnover within some of those sports where, student athletes would have a higher marketability. And, Wisconsin does great. But there's other schools out there that are going to pay, men's basketball athletes $1 million to go play basketball for a year, where we're like, we just can't do it right now. And so it's international athletes, I think, are really primed to have more opportunities here in the States if sport coaches are really wise to pay attention to those things.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. Yeah, because a lot of the kids in the US will just bounce around in order to get these, lucrative contracts, for short-term cash, which will open up the door for these internationals that, that want that 3 or 4 year experience and exposure, build up their resume, build up their experience, then they can look to go professional elsewhere, up during that time. So yeah, it's an open market at this point. So
it really is. And the thing, like in the years that I've been at Madison and UW, we've had a high number of internationals, and just the way they approach their experience with us is so much different than stateside kids. A lot of student athletes coming from the States, they're chasing this like student athlete experience, or the student experience. They understand kind of what the college campus is, and they want to participate in all the fun things college has to offer. Where what I've found over my years here is that a lot of our international students are very, very much so binarily focused. It's sport and it's school. This idea of like the student experience, like they're in Wisconsin, we have a big culture of drinking. And so a lot of kids come to Wisconsin thinking that it's going to be like a party school, right? And you see that all the time, where you'll have student athletes that come in from, let's say, like Chicago or Minneapolis or Florida, and they really take part of the party aspect of our school. I have yet to find an international student where that would be in their top 3. It's, it's always sport, it's school, and then it's usually friendship, relations, religions, things like that. And then like the party aspect is not even part of their conversation. They're just so much more dedicated and determined to find success here academically and athletically, because I think ultimately that's the lure to playing sports in the States, is that you can get a great education and an awesome athletic experience together, where that's not as common in other parts of the world.
I think in speaking to a lot of people here, it's highly looked up to as well, because you are on a bigger stage. Technically, you're on a world stage, really, just competing in the US, because you're competing against other schools that have international student athletes coming in as well, that potentially, if you go to Worlds or something like that for your sport, you might be competing against them again as well. So it becomes more like basically the world is coming to the US, and then you're going to be technically competing on the world stage, where Australia, it's a little bit harder. Like you'll have more Pacific nations, they'll come over for nationals or Oceanias, more like the bigger championships. But if you really want to kind of test where you are, or you think you've got what it takes, you'll go to the US and you'll get an education at the same time.
It's a unique model that unfortunately is kind of getting like torn down right now by all the changes societally within the States, and then just more specifically within NCAA governance. And like, everybody's out there suing the NCAA right now, kind of like, breaking down the establishment that what was. And, it's really bonkers. And it's sad to see, because so many people rely on, college athletics for the opportunities that it provides and presents itself, but also communities rely on it. Universities rely on the funding that athletic departments can bring in. And it's all these things that are being asked for by former student athletes or current student athletes, and they're all in the right for asking these questions and asking for compensation and more flexibility and all those things. But it's really starting to like kind of tear down and erode some of the fabric of what college athletics has historically meant, good or bad.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the future of what's going on with Wisconsin in the next question. But I want to talk about, you kind of alluded to this as well, is like desirable traits and characteristics that make some athletes successful and others fail. Now, when I spent my time there, I kind of knew the sports and then some of the athletes. I knew who was kind of going to be successful, but then in other sports, I kind of knew who was going to like fall short just because you have conversations with them, you see how they train, you see how they carry themselves around others. You know, can you kind of allude to that? Because you've seen so many kids come through the doors in and out. You know who's been successful, and then you know who's also failed, you know, reaching the top level.
Yeah. What I would say, excuse me, is, you know, the student athletes across all the sports that I've seen and worked with across. And I think it's always really important to kind of like pay attention to, like, as strength coaches, we see them primarily in the weight room, right? But each sport and each sports culture based off of the head coach is going to value the weight room differently, right? So like working with women's volleyball, like the weight room is a big part of their culture. It's a big thing of big part of their sport, and something that the sport coaches really values. But we have other sports at Wisconsin where that's not the same value system of the sport culture, or the sport coach. And so what I try not to do is look at like the kids that come in the weight room that aren't really bought into weightlifting, right? And be like, oh, well, they're just not bought into sport, or they're not bought into being excellent. It's like, well, no, it's a value system. And so as I say my response and give you my answer, and I kind of look through those different lenses, and I think that's important to pay attention to it, because like, you know, working with, you know, men's football, soccer here in the States, like it's not a big culture to be in the weight room lifting heavy weights, but, you know, that doesn't mean that my appraisal of their, you know, their work ethic or whatever you want to call it is any less. It's just understanding constraints that they come in with. But ultimately, you know, what I've seen some of them, out of all of our athletes, the ones that have been the most successful are the ones that are, you know, they're good communicators. They're willing to grow and be stretched, and they're willing to be pushed, and that's what they're seeking out. And then also this idea of, you know, like it's not only on their terms. And I think there's so many athletes out there that they'll play great, they'll train great, they'll work out great when they're feeling great, but it's all the other time where it's like, oh, you know, it's today's not a good day. Or, you know, I just, you know, coach yelled at me yesterday, so I'm not really bought into it today. It's the ones that can recognize that, you know, it's me, it's my journey. I'm part of something bigger than that. But it's also, you know, it can't just only be on my terms, because if it's only on my terms, then I'm discrediting my teammate, my coaches, the staff around me that are trying to help me better, and I'm missing out on those opportunities. And it's really, there's got to be a love and passion for what we do. You know, I think what you'll see within college athletics across all the different divisions and sports is that there's some kids who truly love the sport, that they are students of the game. And you know, it's funny because I work with volleyball, and like, sure, there's some athletes that really love volleyball, but hate the weight room, right? But it's funny when you start talking to your athletes, you're like, well, you understand, like there's volleyball, and then there's strength training, and then there's, let's say, injury reduction, corrective exercises, rehabilitation, and there's like the sports psychology, and then there's the nutrition. And it's like, if you look at each of those different parts as being something different than volleyball, you're never going to be as good. But the best athletes I've had is like, I say strength training, they hear volleyball. I say, hey, get more sleep, they hear volleyball. Hey, did you eat breakfast today? They hear, hey, did you do volleyball this morning? And so it's when you can have a very like myopic thinking and mindset about like all these things that go into being an elite level athlete. You could say they're all different than the sport you're doing, or you can just assume that that is your sport. And the student athletes that I've found, they're great communicators. They're bought into this system. They're driven, they have passion, but then they're also always finding ways to pull all these ancillary services and things that typically athletes don't do well. And they just say like, hey, getting 8 hours of sleep, that's volleyball. Or, you know, getting up and having 3 square meals, that's volleyball. Or doing, you know, mindfulness and meditation at night, that's volleyball. It's not these other things. This is volleyball. And, you know, those are some of the biggest traits I've seen. And, you know, some of the things that I've always, you know, loved about our international students is just, I've been really hard pressed to find somebody who's come from overseas that doesn't have those, you know, communication, working hard, love for the sport. They're bought into everything all the time. They're not chasing ancillary things. And that's why I love our international kids, and not to take away from our stateside kids. But all the international kids that I've seen in my time have been really invested into those things. And when expectations haven't actually been met with student athletes or coaches, it's not because they care less. It's just there's a weird vibe. Like, you know, we had a student athlete on our men's soccer team, football team from New Zealand a few years ago, and there's great kid, worked really hard, but it just him and the coach didn't vibe, so he had to move on. But it's every kid, whether or not they stayed for 4 or 5 years, if they left on from overseas, has been really just dedicated to themselves and understand that their body is their craft and their tool to their sport, which allows them to do the things they love and enjoy. So those are some of the bigger things that I've seen out of successful student athletes.
Yeah, no, that was a really good answer. Thanks for that. Now let's go back a step before they even enter the system. So obviously you had the girl from, was it Slovakia? Is that where you went
Poland,
on to?
Poland, yeah.
Poland, sorry.
We played in Slovenia, but she was on the Polish national team. It was just kind of like a meetup spot in Maribor. Yeah.
Yeah, so you met this girl. She's 16 years old at the time, young, very talented. How important it is to have kids that, in middle school and high school. So for us Aussies, it's really just high school, secondary school, to have some sort of athletic base, an athletic development base that's separate from the sport itself.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. And I say this, and there's this like theory I've been developing the past few years, just looking at the differences between our student athletes that come from the States and our student athletes that come abroad. And really this thought that I've been having, this research question, this hypothesis is really predicated on our Polish student athlete, right? And so overseas, specifically in Poland, so my volleyball athlete left her family at the age of 14 to go to a sports school. And the only sport she's ever played is volleyball. And at this sports school, she was basically going to school full-time and playing volleyball full-time. She's playing volleyball in the morning, playing volleyball in the afternoon, playing volleyball at night. And she's playing more volleyball at any given time point as compared to her counterparts in the States. But she comes in, she's healthier. She's more prepared physically, tactically, technically, right? And it's all these things, right? So it's, they're practicing these sports. And then I'm like, well, then why are our Americans broken and all these international student athletes aren't, even though they're doing more of their sport? And one of the things that we see a lot in the States, and there's a big push through different organizations, that this idea of early sports specialization is bad. Like, oh, you should really be thinking about playing multiple sports in your developmental years, because early sports specialization leads to, increased risks of injury, increased risk of mental health or burnout and removal from sport. So if you want to be successful in sport later on in life, you should play a lot of sports early on. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, because when we're recruiting kids when they're 16, 17, or 18, right? And we're going to recruit kids based on technical and tactical expertise, right? Like how good they are at their sport. The only way you get good at your sport is by playing your sport. So if you're busy playing multiple sports through your developmental years, you may be missing out, unless you're a genetic freak, you may be missing out on the technical and tactical proficiencies needed to get noticed by our sport coaches. But, then enter into the American system, like, why are all these international kids, they love the sport, they're not burnt out, they're not injured, but they practice all the time? It's because they do strength training. And, strength training in a lot of these countries we're recruiting our international kids, especially on the team sport perspective, weightlifting, strength training is part of those sports schools. And so like my Polish national player, she'd be practicing 3 days a week or 3 times a day, and then she'd be lifting every day, right? Where in the States, that's not really happening. And so what I like to say is, like, sport is a poison, right? Like the things we do within athletic endeavors, like our human bodies aren't made for that. If you think about like, volleyball, like the defensive passing position, feet wide, toes out, knees knocked, low back rounded, arms long. That's like the worst biomechanical position you could put a human in, right? And now we're going to ask you to do that for 2, 3, 4 hours a day, thousands of reps, high intensity, right? And it's like, that's the worst thing ever. Sport is really poison. Like it breaks down our bodies no matter what you do, right? But strength training, that's the antidote. That's the thing that keeps kids healthy. That's the thing that develops some kind of structural balance, especially at the youth level, where sport may be ramping up from a psychological perspective and from a training level perspective. Being able to come back to strength and conditioning, which is a completely different, novel training stimulus. If you're in a good environment, it should be fun, it should be light, it should be developmental. And so that's the balance that allows kids to specialize early and get really good technically and tactically, but then also build their physical capabilities to stay healthy so they can keep rising the ceiling together, instead of building tactical, physical go down, and then they get injured. And so really, I think all of our student athletes, whether in the States or abroad, should be spending way more time in the weight room, especially if they want to specialize early in sport, because for whatever reason, they want to chase this idea of getting a scholarship. And that's a whole different conversation. But there's nothing more important to, sportsmen and sportswomen than getting in the weight room and strength training, developing those balances.
Well, we've seen that across the NFL combine and draft. Well, the draft just happened, right? The NFL draft. Then we saw the combine, and you've got big offensive linemen. They're hauling in the 40. They're absolutely hauling now. The times in terms of the wide receivers, on average, they're getting lower. The tight ends are getting lower. We've just seen a big explosion in terms of, getting into the gym, the strength and conditioning side, investing the time year round as well, not just, dabble here and there. And that is encompassing with the sport itself, which is going to further highlight the skills and capabilities that they've developed specifically within the sport.
100%. American football is kind of like one of those weird sports in the States. And so if you look at the vast majority of our other sports, like to your point, they practice year round, right? They're competing year round. It's, it's like, with our volleyball athletes, they could be literally playing matches throughout the whole year. They're indoor sport, right? We're not worried about, facilities. We're not worried about weather. American football is weird because really it's just, you play 3 months out of the year. You're playing from like August till December, right? And then the rest of the time throughout the year, you're not playing football. You may be practicing it a little bit, but you are weightlifting. And so people always want to knock on early sport specialization. It's like, well, no, football players specialize in sport. And there's always the ones that we want to highlight: track, basketball, baseball, right? But the vast majority of football players have only ever played football at a high level. But they can only really play and practice for a small period of time throughout the annual calendar. So they play football 3 months a year, but they train 12 months a year, with 9 months of it being specifically on weightlifting and strength conditioning. That's why you're able to see bigger, faster, stronger athletes without a ton of extra injuries, is because they're spending so much more time weightlifting than a lot of our other sports would per se. And again, it's this balance between sport development and general physical preparation.
Keep an eye out on the second installment of our conversation. If you want to stay updated on the latest episodes, make sure to subscribe to Inner Athlete on both YouTube and Spotify.